Welcome back to Preserving Our Past, Informing Our Future. I'm Sydney Stevenson, and this series is produced through the School of Occupational Therapy at Texas Women's University. In our first episode, Dr. Reed shared her personal journey that led her to become occupational therapy's foremost historian. Today, we take a closer look at the founders themselves and the vision that shaped their work. When we think about that pivotal meeting of the National Society for the Promotion of Occupational Therapy, it's easy to focus on it as a single moment. But what's more compelling is the perspectives these individuals brought with them. Many were not operating within traditional medical spaces, but were instead grounded in communities, observing how people lived, worked, and found meaning in their daily lives. As we revisit their work, we're invited to ask, what did these early leaders truly understand about occupation, and how might their original vision challenge the way we think about practice today? Dr. Reed, let's dive in. All right, so our first question is, when you look back at the founding of occupational therapy, that 1917 meeting of the National Society for the Promotion of Occupational Therapy, what stands out most to you about its original vision?
I think a major focus was really their commitment to trying to put together a system that really could respond to what they saw as as lacking in society at that time. Now, if you look a little bit at the background of what was going on in society at the time, it really was a period of awakening of of support for that humanism concept. There were something like 40 organizations that started at that time, that all were trying to address what they saw as issues in society. OT and PT and two or three others were the only ones who ultimately survived. But for instance, Barton was into the Emmanuel movement, which was a Christian church organization. But our founders were certainly taking taking a view and trying to understand and put together some system to address what they saw as needs in society at that time. Which is important for us, I think, to appreciate. As we talk a little bit about why they were into the community, I'll expand on that. But I think it's so easy for us to try to understand the history of OT based on what we know today, and what we've grown up with. And that simply is not what was going on in 1917. So I think we have to appreciate the concern that was being expressed at the time, that moral treatment had come on. And the whole idea of moral treatment was to accept that people did not lose their humanism, their human characteristics, because they were not able at the moment to perform in a way that society expected humans to perform. At the time, when a person had a mental illness, they were assumed to revert to some sort of animal characteristics. That's why they caged them, because that's what they did with animals back then. You can also look at how zoos performed at that time, as opposed to how a zoo is typically organized today. And yes, animals were put in cages, and that's what we did. That's what they were doing in England before the moral treatment took over. If you were considered to have lost your sanity and become insane, you needed to be caged. And moral treatment was one of the first attempts then to say, no, you don't need to be caged. You need to help your system reestablish some of what, for some reason, has gone astray uh, into normal activity, normal, what we now call occupation. So the founders were picking up on those ideas uh, that that because you had a physical disability, for example, did not make you an animal, because your cardiac system and cardiac conditions were a major area of concern at the time because your cardiac system didn't allow you to function very well. Did not mean that you were worthless. That you have what we now call cerebral palsy, it's known as Little's disease back then, didn't make you worthless. And if you had a mental illness, it didn't mean that, first of all, that you might be put in a cage, but then at the time, the founders, that you needed to be sent to an institution setting, which were all at the time as far away from the city as possible. Because you were not considered to be acceptable in society. Therefore, you needed to be removed from society. And the way to do that was to put you out in the countryside. So our founders were, aware of all of these, and were trying to find ways to enable people to not become so isolated, and not to be considered worthless or useless or unacceptable or, having reverted to some sort of animal characteristic. So that was their vision, to sort of summarize that. For those who were considered not to be able to contribute, to be able to contribute. And for those who had lost their ability to contribute, usually through some sort of mental illness, to regain their ability to contribute. So sort of the two ends of the spectrum, those that were considered useless and those who were considered to have lost their usefulness.
No, that's a really powerful story. I really enjoy hearing about that. I didn't know that all of the institutions were placed outside of cities and rural areas. I did not know that before this. That's so interesting. And it makes
Yes.
sense that they did that.
Well, and it's really important to understand that now because most of those institutions now, well, okay, yeah, they didn't change their location. The cities that were once 10 or 15 miles away crept up to the institution's front door and surrounded it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, and or those institutions no longer exist. A number have been abandoned. There's a website of institutions that have been abandoned. But if you look at their location on a map, most of them are now within some city's boundary, which is another thing to remember. Part of the rationale is that they didn't want some of those people to be able to participate in society. And in 1917, and again, as said, not everybody owned an automobile back then. They might have owned a horse and buggy, but you realize that 15 or 20 miles out in the country with a horse and buggy took you a better part of the day to get there. And if you wanted to get home, you better leave by about 2 in order to get home.
Yeah.
So even if you wanted to go visit your relative or friend at one of those institutions, it was a day-long journey, not a case of, you know, 45 minutes across town and you'll be home by supper.
Kind of what we're getting at with this is that they've been isolated from the community. You yourself have noted that all of the founders, with the exception of Dr. Denton, were community based practitioners. Why do you think
Yeah.
that's important?
Well, okay, now some more history to hospitals, which we now see as health and life-saving institutions, were at that time considered death traps. Most people were not born in hospitals. My parents, who were born in '07 and '08, were both born at home. Hospitals, were not routinely using what we now consider to be standard practices. And penicillin was not available. Penicillin is not created in 1927, but didn't become widely available until after World War II. So hospitals had a bad reputation, uh, and in many cases they did not exist. In 1917 in Houston, there was no hospital. During the World War I, there was a camp, it was called Camp Custer, that basically treated people with soldiers who had tuberculosis. huh? Uh, San Antonio had an institution for the insane and also had a camp, Travis, which became now Brooke Army Hospital. Um, Dallas had a couple of doctor clinic kinds of things. And occasionally, apparently, they might allow some 2 or 3 of their patients to stay over either in their home or at the clinic. But again, in Texas, hospitals were pretty much non-existent until the 20s. The real push for the hospitals as we know them followed World War II, what's known as the Hill-Burton Act of 1947. It was really World War II that brought to people's attention that they needed facilities to treat people. Doctors' offices were nice, but they didn't really come with surgery suites. So even though we're talking about the East Coast, which did have a few hospitals, it said mostly hospitals were for poor people. If you had any money, you had the doctor come to your home. And if you needed nursing care, you had the nurse come to your home and in many cases stay in your home while your relative, parent, kid recovered from whatever their condition was. And of course, it was mental illness, then you got sent to the country. Uh, so the reason the founders did not have hospital experience, they did have some institutional experience, was because it really wasn't there. It's probably Dr. Dunton's is probably the primary person who understood, though, that something like hospitals, because he had worked in, institutions, was on the horizon, and that magazine Modern Hospital that started in 1913, okay? And why was it called Modern Hospital? Because it was trying to create the hospital system that we now, simply take for granted. So it was probably his vision, though, that really helped the founders understand that they were going to have to make an impression on what was developing as the hospital system. See, and the other magazine, Train Nurse and Hospital Review, is another example of that early magazines shaping what we now know as, a countrywide hospital care system. But in 1917, it did not exist. Large institutions designed to warehouse people, so you could be warehoused for mental illness. You could also be, in the women's history, there is a fair amount of knowledge, and some OTs are aware of it. That if husbands decided that they didn't want to be married to their wives anymore, they simply told the doctor that that she was losing her mind, and the doctor, of course, being male and understanding that, sent the wife to the institution. That became grounds for divorce, and the guy got to marry whatever person he had in mind. Or if he was tired of being married altogether, he was now off the hook. Okay. And the other thing, which Eleanor Clark Schlegel was so aware of, is that if you could not support yourself, then the only place to go was this institution in the country. So that was in the United States, that the poorhouse, which they talk about in Europe, and in Europe they had poorhouses for people who couldn't. In the U.S., the poorhouse was this institution in the country. So many of the people that were in these institutions were not mentally ill. Some of them were given the label so the husbands could divorce them or declare them dead. It's interesting. Some of them, although they were alive, they were officially dead.
Wow.
Uh, and or the person simply had no means to support themselves. They were physically disabled, or simply had no skills, and vocational rehab, as we know it, did not exist. It's another outgrowth of World War One, was the really development of vocational education. Vocational rehab, as we know, is World War Two. So that's what our founders were aware of. Susan Johnson was in charge of the institutions that had sprung up in the New York area. Of course, Schlegel was running this program out of the Illinois Mental Health Society's uh, entity. The workshops were actually in two houses. Of course, Kidner was coming from Canada and had been recruited because of his knowledge of industrial type education in the Canadian schools to work with the military commission in Canada. And of course, Canada was involved in World War One 3 years before we were, and so he had already had a lot of experience with returning soldiers. The Canadian system brought their soldiers back. When the US entered, they tried to treat their people in Europe until the war ended. That's how we got our Reconstruction aids.
Mhm.
So, our early people, well, and of course, Barton himself was running a community treatment center, quote unquote, out of, well, not actually out of his house. It was a building behind his house for people that he saw, like himself, who was both physically disabled because of the amputation of his part of his foot from it freezing while he was doing survey work in Colorado, and the fact that he had tuberculosis.
So, Dr. Reed, in your research, you discovered that much of the founders' writing appeared not in OT journals, but in publications, as you mentioned earlier, like Modern Hospital and the Trained Nurse and Hospital Review. What does that tell us about how they position the profession?
Yes, as I said, I think we have to credit Dr. Denton with understanding that that hospitals were going to become more central to the healthcare delivery system. I don't recall in reading his writings that he ever really says that. But I think his positioning of his own writing and his encouragement of the other founders to participate, in the journals, suggests that it was really his vision, and understanding that the role of hospitals was gonna become more important, and that publishing in journals. Modern Hospital, I said, was the chief one, but another one was called simply Hospitals. Also, he published in that journal, and they carried some of the conference announcements over the years. So I think we have to credit him with the vision to really push for understanding how to advertise OT. Because that's where I found most of the early literature. So hats off to his ability to understand, what was happening to the healthcare delivery system at the time. Then, and then of course, essentially over the years, then hospitals became i- uh, the major employment of OT. Relatively few community centers then had OTs. Some of that had to do with cost. The early understanding of what OT could offer really began to be centered in hospital care as opposed to community care. At various times then, I remember when I was a young therapist, home care was beginning to be a source, that some therapists could participate in. But of course, the reimbursement was not there. And when Medicare and Medicaid came in, again, talk about loading up the hospital system and then the developing nursing home system, which is, okay, you can argue there are more nursing homes in communities, but a nursing home is an institution. You stay there. It's not it's not what so many of our founders were involved in community settings in which you came for therapy and went home or went to a boarding home, or in other words, you didn't stay overnight in the center where you were getting treated. So, the idea of community settings struggled thereafter. It said that Dr. Denton was right on in where he saw where we should be publishing.
So, Dr. Reed, in your view, What did early leaders like Slagle, Dutton, and Meyer understand about occupation that we risk overlooking today?
Of course, much of the initial work was with people who had chronic conditions, but Slagle had experience in, uh, well, the example I gave of the boy who, or young lad whose feet got frozen in, okay, that's not an acute illness, but it is an acute injury and requires, sort of starting from scratch the occupation that he had had in the ice cube business was over. One of the things that we've really had to put together, and I'm not always sure we do it well, is understanding that occupation is part of a process. And I'm not sure how well I understood that until I had an acute illness in 1991. And of course, I was already an OT, so I could reflect both on how I was recovering from this acute illness and with the knowledge of what OT supposedly was supposed to offer. And could I treat myself? And understanding that initially occupation needs to be looked at from a much different perspective because the body is in a recovery mode. And I
Mhm.
said I talk about the arguments I think my brainstem had with my frontal cortex. My frontal cortex was all game for getting back into the occupation swing. My brainstem was not on the same page. That my brainstem said my physiology needed work. My uh, frontal cortex said, "Hey, I'm bored. Let's do something." The brainstem won for at least 3 weeks. That I could start an activity. I mean, even such a simple thing as making soup. Requiring put a pan on the stove, turn it on, and pour in the can of soup. Um, were major excursions, from my bed to the kitchen to, get get getting the pan out, getting the soup out, and putting them together and turning it, uh, which occupation. Well, it turned out to be all I could manage, and in fact, I had to, as a typical can of Campbell soup, I could only manage to eat half of it, and so I learned to literally put half of it in the pan, put the other half back in the fridge. And so I think that's one of the things that we really need to be aware of more. And that I began to talk to students more about the fact that people can be, you can bring them or you can take the therapy to their room or bring them to the clinic and you're all set to go. And 15 minutes later, they look like they're tuned out. It's not your fault. That's all the physiology will allow. Brainstem has taken over,
Mhm.
uh, and that we probably ought to parse. I know some clinics do that now, but they tend to parse down to, like 20 minutes, whatever the break is for reimbursement, which may actually be too long initially. And the problem is that the 15 minutes, for instance, that it took me to, get the soup, you know, I needed 3 or 4 hours of rest before I could do the 15 minutes again. It isn't a case of work 15 minutes, rest 15 minutes. No, that
No, no.
and so we need to understand occupation to being able to work the 8-hour day, or as many families will tell you, it's not 8 hours, it's 24. That just because you're sleeping doesn't mean the occupations go away. 'Cause you
Mm.
still have to be alert to the diapers need to be changed, or has the child gotten out of bed, or, has the fire alarm gone off? I'm not sure how well we're doing that. I think our founders had a better understanding of that, particularly Slagle. And when she talks about putting together that program, which actually a physician had helped start, of working with the people whose capacity to function had essentially returned to that of a very young child. And so the first thing you had to do, frankly, was get them out of bed in the morning, and then get them to the point where they could eat breakfast, and get them to dress. And that these were not the tasks on the way to work; those were the tasks for today. Well, it's obvious that Slagle had managed to learn that process. Dutton was working with a different when he talks about what he was doing with clients, these were clients who were more functioning a little higher level. They were or somebody was already helping them with those, uh, basic, ADL type tasks. He was more into the occupation area. And, his long-lasting contribution was what's known as the Baltimore quilt, where he came up with a group activity of having women essentially each work on a patch, and the patch would be like a 10-inch or 12-inch diameter, mostly embroidery, although some of it was applique. And then those patches were then sewn together to make the quilts, thus the Baltimore quilt pattern. And that is still recognized both as a technique in quilt making, but as an approach to an activity to recreate some socialization projects. Meyer was looking more, again at that timeline, and he's the one who talks most about starting people with simple occupations in bed, and then having them sit beside the bed, and then coming to one of his workshops for a period of time and building up their time in the workshop until they could approximate what they would need in a standard employment setting. So his idea of graded occupation, I think, uh, uh, is still an accepted principle uh,
Yes.
in
Yes.
OT. And so that's probably his major contribution to our OT literature at this point. I think we have to teach that in our program. I'm not sure we back it up with the fact that we have learned this process, uh, and that occupation has to work in connection with our physiology and our anatomy. Probably more our physiology than most people's anatomy at the time in which we see them. I guess when we're working with very young infants, the two blend together a little bit more. But mostly for adults, I think it's our physiology that gets more in our way. When I was acutely ill, it wasn't that I couldn't move. I could. It's that I couldn't move for very long, which is more physiology than anatomy. I think we learned from our founders. I'm not sure we give them the credit they deserve. The two things I think of as that students need most is to increase their observation skills and maximize their mental flexibility. Observation gives you the facts, and the mental flexibility gives you the clinical reasoning to put the facts together. And I so acutely remember that there were days when I thought, I'm making real progress, and then the next day it's like, no, I am not making any progress today. And then the next day would be a little bit better. But, in other words, recovery is uneven. And so you can think, yeah, okay, my client yesterday was able to do X. Okay, so today we will do Y. Only you discover that Y isn't going to work. We're back to X. In fact, we may be back to V.
Mhm.
We're not even up to X.
Yeah.
Uh, I think that's disheartening for students initially because you spend so much time, trying to figure out what the legitimate treatment program should be for your client, and you've got it all organized, and it just falls apart in front of your face.
Yes, that's something that I've definitely experienced throughout field work where it's like, I have this whole plan, it's gonna be so great, and then you get in there and it's like, "We are not doing this
Not
today."
that ain't gonna no, yeah, and spending time on B and C is not what you wanna do when you just struggled to put A together.
I think that's where that flexibility has to come in, and it's like, we have to be able to adapt on
Mental
the spot.
yeah, well, and mental flexibility is also just a requirement for us to be able to see ways to do things that are not written down. No matter how well you have studied your client, at some point or another, they throw a wrinkle into your plans. And part of our mental flexibility has to be able to, is to be able to deal with that. Students often want to know, well, why can't you just write down steps 1 through 10, and that's what we're going to do. If we could do that, there would be no OT. I always have trouble with therapists, particularly who come from military backgrounds, because they want to manualize everything. That is to, write down, we will do this, do this, do this, do this. Somewhere in the middle of that, you've lost OT. And yes, that drives physicians nuts when you try to explain to them what you're doing, and you say, "But sometimes we have to do that before we can do this," and they say, "Why are you doing that?" It's always a pleasure to work with physicians who somehow or other also manage to maintain some of their mental flexibility,
Mm,
to be able to understand, you don't go from A to B to C to D to E to, or step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. That's rare. More often, it's sort of a, step forward and a little bit back and there's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward routine. I think our founders understood that. I think for those who wrote about it, experienced that firsthand often enough to have, been able to say, here's what we're trying to do, and here's what happens.
yes. Dr. Reed, I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us today. I think it's so relevant to our practice today. And I also want to say thank you for sharing a little bit of your own personal story and your own struggles with your physiology in a way.
The arguments my brain had with itself.
Yes, yes. So, one of the things that comes through really clearly in this conversation is that the founders of OT weren't just creating a profession, they were shaping a way of thinking about people, health, and the role of meaningful activity in everyday life. Their work was grounded in observation and community and a deep belief that occupation mattered. What's really striking is how much of their original vision still feels relevant today. The settings have definitely changed and the profession has evolved a lot, but the core questions about what occupation is and why it matters remain just as important. In our next episode, we'll explore the philosophical foundations that influenced these early ideas and the tensions that emerged as occupational therapy found its place within the medical world. Thank you for listening and stay with us.